My name is Karen Terry. I'm a professor here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and I'm one of the hosts of this event, along with Preeti Chauhan, also from John Jay College. This event is sponsored by the Open Society Foundation's Justice Fund, including Terrence Pitts, Lenny Noisette, and Gloria Medina, with partial travel support provided by the California Endowment. So we'd like to take this opportunity to thank both of those organizations. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank our steering committee members who represent law enforcement, including Gary McCarthy, Jim Bierman, and Bernard Melekian. Community advocates, including Susan Lee, Reverend Ed Copeland, and Pastor Mike McBride. And academics, including David Kennedy, Philip Atiba Goff, Tom Tyler, and Richard Rosenfeld. We have a really dynamic committee, and they've really helped us to put this workshop together, and we think this is going to be a great success, so thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to echo Karen's comments and say thank you to our steering committee who has put in a lot of time and dedication in putting together this two-day workshop. Just by the way of background, Karen, Terrence Pitts, our program officer, and I began planning these workshops back in November, so quite a while ago, with the goal of disseminating knowledge on innovative policing practices nationwide. So our focus was on three different areas: community responses to crime, promoting police legitimacy, and improving police relations with minority communities. So at that time, little did we know that our work would be so timely right now. Indeed, with the tragic death of Eric Garner in Staten Island, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Ezell Ford in Los Angeles, the time is really now to start having these conversations. And I think the need for this dialogue is so pressing and of great interest, and it's evident in terms of the geographic representation that's here today. So we have law enforcement and community members from Los Angeles, Oakland, Fresno, California, Providence, New Orleans, New Haven, High Point, and New York, and still a few others. So thank you to those who have traveled great distances for coming here today. So with this workshop, we went to great lengths to bring all sides and perspectives to the table, including community representatives, law enforcement, and academics. This is because we and I believe that in order for true change to come about in policing, the efforts must be collaborative, hence the title, Bridging the Great Divide, and Community Police Partnerships. Indeed, as the title, So a large part of today's program, as you know, will focus on the role of democracy in policing and how the media influences stories about policing, which will start at 6 o'clock. Tomorrow, we're actually going to focus on two very successful partnerships between communities and police, focusing on the Advancement Project Urban Peace in Los Angeles and the PICO Network and Ceasefire in Oakland. For those of you who are not participating in tomorrow's workshop, we encourage you to join us via live stream. The website is on top of the agenda. And also, if you want to tweet about this event, we have the hashtag also on top of the agenda. So now I'd like to introduce the chair of our first panel and the moderator, Dr. Richard Rosenfeld. Dr. Rosenfeld is the Founders Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. He has published widely on crime trends, crime statistics, and criminal justice policy. His current research focuses on the effects of police patrol strategies on crime. He's a fellow and past president of the American Society of Criminology, and he currently serves on the Science Advisory Board of the Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice. He's also the principal investigator of the St. Louis Public Safety Partnership and consults regularly with the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. So on a personal note, I've been very fortunate to work with Rick on 3 different projects, and I've learned a tremendous amount from him. He's a thoughtful scientist, a sophisticated researcher, and also a pleasure to be around. So it's a privilege to be working with him and a privilege to be introducing him. Dr. Rosenfeld.
Thank you, Preeti. Both Karen and Preeti mentioned the steering committee that organized this event. And I too want to say the steering committee did an especially good job. One of the things the steering committee did was develop a set of questions around the conference theme that were distributed after some give and take and negotiation, were distributed to our panelists. And we ask our panelists to frame their remarks around one or more of these questions. They could certainly go beyond the questions, but touch base with at least a few of them in their remarks. But there's no need to keep the questions a secret, so let me read them to you, and then we'll start off. Number one, what are the basic attributes and requirements of policing in a democracy? How can democratic policing address crime problems in a community? Two, what lessons can we learn, for example, from recent tragic events in Ferguson, Missouri, or in Staten Island that can help us refine policing to be more democratic? Three, in what ways does the current state of policing embody the principles and practices of democratic policing? In what ways does it diverge from those principles and practices? Four, we ask the panelists, if you could wave a magic wand, what are the 2 or 3 major changes you would introduce into policing? Five, does it matter whether or not community residents see the police as a legitimate force? Six, what have you seen that works in terms of building genuine partnerships between cops and communities, and what are the results of those efforts? That is, what types of constructive agreements can be made that enhance public safety and democratic policing? That might be a useful question and charge for the Attorney General's announcements this afternoon that the Justice Department is going to conduct an investigation of the Ferguson Police Department and perhaps other agencies in St. Louis County. Seven, in a country marked by increasing inequality and lack of opportunity, especially along race lines, what role might police play in reversing those trends and strengthening our democracy? Eight, is it necessary to tolerate a rise in disorder and crime in order to make policing more democratic? And I added one to the list, but it's a trick question, as you'll soon see. 9, have officer-involved shootings increased or decreased over the past 20 years, or, if you will, over the past 10 years, or over the past 2 years? It's a trick question because no answer exists for that question. One, as a researcher, I would argue it's one of the more basic questions we might ask to begin an intelligent conversation about police in the community, especially with regard to the recent tragic events here and also in my home community. We simply have no information that would enable us to say with any degree of precision or accuracy whether officer-involved shootings have gone up or down over time. That should be one of the first, if not the first, requirements that Congress, one hopes, imposes on the Justice Department or the Justice Department imposes on itself. We need that information. It needs to be nationwide. Those are the questions. Our panelists are experts, and so they are free to venture beyond those questions. Let me introduce our panelists. First up is Susan Cruz. You can read a lot about our panelists in the information you received about the conference. If I were to read all of the bios for all of the speakers, I'd take up at least half their time, so I'm only going to give you the high points. Susan Cruz is the director of Fronteras. Recently, she's worked on a knowledge exchange project at the World Bank. With that, let me introduce Susan Cruz. Susan, please take about 10 minutes, and all of our panelists, please limit your remarks to about 10 minutes so we have plenty of time left for discussion.
Good afternoon. I'm going to start with something to get everyone a little energized and also to make it very interactive. All of you who have birthdays from the months of January through June, please put your hands up. Put your hands where I can see them. For the duration of my comments, I want you to hold your hands up. Please, I will do the same as well. My birthday's in March. I'm being democratic about this. So, I don't see your hands over there. I know that table over there. I know there's people over there with birthdays in the first half of the year. I see you, LA. I want you to understand what it's like to forever, since the moment that you have any knowledge of what it's like to walk outside of your house and onto your neighborhood and to your school and to your place of employment and to the corner store, what it's like to always feel that you have to walk around like this. I want you to let that sink in for a minute, because many of you don't know what that's like. Many of you are probably looking at me like, who the hell does she think she is telling me to put my hands up? It's not my fault that I was born in April. But that's the whole point. You have no control over when you were born. And I'm asking you to do something based on something you have no control over. Seems unfair, right? But I'm being democratic about it because I was also born, in the first half of the year. See, some of you are already putting your hands down. Am I going to have to go around and check IDs? Am I going to have to get up out of the seat and come, and search your wallet, ask you questions, ask you why you're not being cooperative? Why can't you just do what I'm asking you to do? And the next thing I want you to think about is this. Those of you that put your hands down, you're probably thinking, you know what, this is baloney. I came here out of my own free will, to hear this panel and to participate. I'm putting something into this too. Why do I have, to tolerate this? This is ridiculous. I'm going to complain. I don't like this woman. And you have every right to. In the very same way that citizens feel that their tax dollars are being invested in something that should be there to protect and to serve them. Some of you are going to probably come up to me during the break and give me a piece of, of your mind. And it might get ugly. The point that I'm trying to make is this. People get tired of this. And they get tired especially when they feel that they have no recourse, when they file complaints, when they speak up, when they go about the processes which are guaranteed to them, assembling, exercising the right to free speech. And what do they get? More violence, more oppression, more anger, more loss of rights, and some loss of life and freedom. So for those of you that put your hands down because you can, think about those people who can't. Thank you. You can put your hands down.
Thank you. Next up is Bernard Melekian. He served 36 years, he's had 36 years, I should say, of local law enforcement experience, including serving as the police chief for the city of Pasadena for 13 years. He was director of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services that will play a role, by the way, in the Justice Department's investigation in St. Louis County. And he served in that capacity until March 2013. Dr. Melekian is the founder and president of Paratus Group, a law enforcement consulting firm.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to talk with everyone. Following Susan's remarks will be difficult. I'm not sure what to ask people to do, but perhaps just listen to me for a second. In all seriousness, her remarks tied in directly. I intended to open my remarks by saying that I had been in law enforcement for a long time, and that there were two significant incidents that had happened to me over my career that shaped how I viewed things. In addition to my policing experience, I spent 25 years in the Coast Guard Reserve. It included 2 active duty deployments, including one in Saudi Arabia in 1991 during the first Gulf War. And towards the end of that deployment, we were permitted to go to the town of Khobar. And while there, it was very clear that there were defined limits as to how far we were to go. The Saudi government did not particularly want us to be there, and they strictly limited how far we were going to be allowed to wander around the marketplace. In the course of wandering around, I observed what I correctly found out was a building that appeared to be a police station, and it appeared to be change of shift, and there were uniformed officers coming out, and I took some pictures of them. And as I did that, I was suddenly confronted by two uniformed personnel with submachine guns who were clearly not very happy with me. And they were yelling at me in Arabic, and it was very clear to me that I had annoyed them, but I didn't have any idea how or why. I did remember some young lieutenant saying before we left that if we got in trouble with the local authorities, there was very little that the U.S. government could do for us, which was not a comforting thought right at that moment. It turns out, after about 5 to 10 minutes of this, they took the film out of my camera and sent me on my way. And it turns out that it is illegal to take pictures of public buildings in Saudi Arabia. I won't say that this epiphany occurred at that moment, because at that moment I was simply angry and annoyed and all those kinds of things. But as I had time to reflect on what had happened, it occurred to me that I had clearly violated, if not the law, at least the cultural norms, although cultural norms that I did not understand. And it was explained to me with an implied threat of violence in a language that I did not understand. And I was simply, at the end of it, initially grateful to be done, and subsequently angry, and it shaped my sort of perception or perspective of the government and what I was doing. It also then occurred to me that for the bulk of my law enforcement career, I would like to believe that I have treated people with equity and dignity and avoided abusing authority and all those high-sounding things. But it occurred to me that if my perception of myself was right, what was equally true, that it was true because I chose it to be so. I was on the giving end of power and had been for most of my adult life working in this career. And this incident in the Khobar marketplace in Saudi Arabia was one of the few times that I had been on the receiving end of power. And it was illustrative. And I don't know whether I completely concur that policing in America produces a sense among vast majorities of people of continual oppression, but I do have a sense that it produces a sense of inequity and two systems that are at play and that they are not equally applied. The second incident that affected me, I was the chief of police in Pasadena, and Pasadena's image for the country is that it has 2 square miles of mansions, and once a year it has a parade. The reality is very different. It is the 4th largest city in Los Angeles County. It is home to the oldest African-American community in Southern California. It is home to some of the richest and some of the poorest people in Los Angeles. And it had a murder rate of over 20 homicides per year for decades, most of them gang-related, most of them young men of color, and it was accepted as kind of the norm. And a number of programs were introduced when I got there that were under the rubric of something called No More Dead Children, and we, in the short version, reduced homicides dramatically. We had 30 months of zero, and got a lot of kudos for that, which meant that I, as the chief, got to spend a lot of time congratulating myself. Until one evening, a young man by the name of Maurice Clark was shot and killed by the Pasadena police. Maurice Clark was not a gang member, but he hung out with them. He was a young African American. He was armed at the time of his stop and, in fact, fired his weapon. But nevertheless, the community outcry and anger was palpable. And there was a community meeting one Saturday, and I misread just how deep this anger was going to go because the facts of the case were so apparent. Mr. Clark fled from the police. Mr. Clark was carrying a gun. Mr. Clark fired the gun. The officers responded. For 3.5 hours, I was on the receiving end of community anger. That it was very clear very quickly had very little to do with Maurice Clark, and everything to do with how young officers treat people on the street on a daily basis, everything to do with a perceived lack of caring on the part of local government, lack of jobs, failed schools, all of these things that the police only marginally touch. And yet, we are in many ways, to use an academic phrase, we are in many ways the rational actors that are expected to find some way to respond to this. A number of years ago, I had Eldridge Cleaver come and speak to the Pasadena Police Department. It was fascinating to me because when I was a young officer, I was looking for Eldridge Cleaver. I thought he might be somewhere on the beaches of Santa Monica, but he wasn't. He was somewhere else. And I talked to him at breakfast, and I said, it's really kind of amazing that here you are about to come and speak to a group of police officers, and in your day, you were famous for hating the police. And he said, you know, as I think about it, he said, we didn't really hate the police. We hated the government, and we hated the inequity of it. The police were just the only arm of government we ever saw. He said, and some of them were good, and some of them were bad, and most of them were in the middle somewhere. And I will close with a suggestion that I hope that we do not follow the lead of Winston Churchill, who once said, when all is said and done, usually more is said than done. Because we have had these conversations before, we have had these conversations for years, and I would merely suggest that it is time to have a true dialogue and to recognize that the men and women who serve in officers and in radio cars and in uniform in this country, most of them are trying to do the best that they know how. And we don't tell them very well what we want them to do. And if anything constructive can come out of this, we ought to begin to define that. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Connie Rice. Connie is a civil rights lawyer, and I just love this in her biography, who engineers systemic fixes to entrenched inequality and injustice. The California Law Business Journal twice designated her one of the top 10 most influential attorneys in California. Connie?
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. How are you? It's wonderful to be back in the Big Apple from California. In fact, I live in Pasadena, and I remember well Barney being the chief there. You know, these are such fabulous questions. I thought I'd just go down them and very, very quickly. But before I do, when you see me sitting up here, there are at least 15 other people sitting beside me. They're just not up here. And I want you to meet just a few of them, because I am here with the most spectacular police reform engine, a cadre of individuals who have changed LAPD and helped LAPD reach a point that I can say, we have the solution. We've done it. I don't know if anybody's interested in looking, but we've done it, and I wanted you to meet the spectacular team that has helped LAPD not only understand the community, but actually begin to identify as part of it. It is an incredible 180-degree turnaround, to the point where I think I can safely say we will never have another Rodney King riot. We may have another kind of riot, but we're never going to have another Rodney King riot. I am here with a spectacular woman who has executed all of our police reform as well as gang intervention and violence reduction strategies in Southern California and elsewhere around the country. She is a Yale and Bolt-trained lawyer, but more than that, she is spectacular at getting all of the different silos to work together to produce public safety for children. Her name is Susan Lee. Susan, stand up. She is surrounded by the most spectacular team of gang intervention workers in the country. They work with LAPD daily. And when you come into my offices, you'll see officers with their gun belts and their tasers and their handcuffs and all the paraphernalia that they have with their badges and fruit salad on their shirts. And then you'll turn around and you'll see a bunch of guys who look like they stepped out of a gang. And that's because they have. They are gang intervention experts. They are the people who, without badges, without shields, without guns, patrol the streets with LAPD. They intervene after a gang shooting to make sure there are no retaliation shootings. They are the reason that LAPD's retaliation shooting rate has plummeted over 95%. I want you to meet the best gang intervention workers in the country. Guys, please stand up. You have Ron Noblet, Gerald Cavett, Mike Garcia, Mike Arion, Antonio Crisostomo, and Fernando Rayon. Fernando actually runs the gang intervention programs for my group, the Advancement Project. Now, would you like me to go down these questions, or do you just want to hear me talk? Go down the questions. Okay. That's what I heard, but I'm going to do. What are the basic attributes and requirements of policing in a democracy? I think it's policing anywhere, democracy or not. I think that the basic attributes require public trust, transparency, accountability, and lack of bias. Number two, what lessons can we learn, for example, from recent tragic events in Ferguson, Missouri, or in Staten Island, New York, that can help us refine policing to be more democratic? I'm not interested in becoming more democratic. I'm interested in becoming more effective and more fair. And in order to become more effective and more fair, the lessons that we draw, number one, just don't do anything they've done in Ferguson. Everything they've done has been wrong. So whatever they've done, don't do. The other thing is cops have to have common sense. If somebody is trafficking in stolen cigarettes, who cares? It's never worth killing somebody over that. So it comes, common sense is something that isn't taught in police academies. I'll never forget when Ted Hunt, the head of the police union, told me, well, Connie, see, here's the problem. We're taught how to clean our guns, we're taught how to shoot our guns, but we're never told when to shoot them. I said, okay, we're going to start there, I guess. So the lessons, the most obvious lessons, are that the training has to have common sense. The cops have to use judgment. If you're going after a misdemeanor, you should never end up with a dead anybody. And basically, if you don't have enough of a relationship with individuals in a community, especially communities that are considered high crime, you will get bad policing. You will not have enough of a relationship for the cop to be able to look at somebody and say, oh, I know that kid. I know their family. I know his grandmother. When you have a cop who can say those things, you have a much, much, much lower level of friction. You have a much, much lower level of perceived bias on either end. And what you get, because there's a relationship there, what you get is you get a negotiation with the cop and you get a common sense solution is what I have found. So when we encouraged LAPD to get out of their squad cars, co-patrol with the gang intervention experts so that they're on foot in the community talking to kids all day long. What we have found in a group what we call the Community Safety Partnership that we created with Chief Beck of LAPD, what we have found is that even in housing projects, as you know, are ground zero for cop-public friction. there's war and there's hatred between public housing residents and the police. I have found that in every city I've ever been in. Used to be the same in LAPD. Used to be the same in LA. But we created a force. Susan and I and Chief Beck created a force, and we did an experiment. Ladies and gentlemen, this experiment is the answer. We call them the Community Safety Partnership Police. 10 officers for 4 housing projects. 50 officers. 10 cops per housing project with 10 supervisors. So there's never a break in coverage. It's 24/7, no vacations interrupt. It's constant. And what we told these cops, and they looked at me like I was absolutely out of my mind when I told them this, I said, here's my vision. We're going to teach you a way to police so that this community will revere you and love you. And in return, when you look at a little black boy, instead of seeing an arrest stat, instead of seeing somebody you can beat the tar out of with your baton and never get a complaint, instead of seeing somebody you can shoot with impunity, instead of seeing someone you hate, when you look at a little black boy or a little Latino kid in the housing projects, you, my great officer, are going to feel love. Now, Chief Beck took the microphone and said, I know Connie sounds like she's crazy, but what she means is we're going to get the respect of the community by serving them. And that's what they do. The first day they got there, Mrs. Tolliver and Mrs. Day cussed them out, and they said, Ms. Day, we know you don't like us. We're very sorry we killed your son. Ms. Tolliver, we're very sorry we killed your son and your grandson. We know you hate us, but we're here. Tell us what you'd like to do. So they told him, clean up the Grape Street Alley. The Grape Street Alley was an open sore. They had mattresses. People would have sex on them in the open air. You had drug dealing, junkies back there shooting up. It was a mess. It was so dangerous because this Grape Street territory, Grape Street Crips, that Public Works would not come and clean it up. And so the community wanted that place cleaned up. It had never been cleaned up. LAPD got on the phone and told them, if you don't get your trucks down here tomorrow, we're arresting you. Public Works got down there. By the time LAPD and Public Works got done, you could do surgery in that alley. The grandmothers were elated. They told them the next thing that they wanted was, you know, the elders can't read the newspaper because they can't afford the bifocals. So LAPD went out and got 800 pairs of bifocals. Next, they found out there were a lot of people with diabetes who hadn't been diagnosed, so they got USC to bring the medical vans in, and they tested everybody for diabetes and treated for diabetes. Next, the local principal said, well, you know, LAPD, the kids don't have any tablets or computers. So LAPD went to the west side. There's so much money in LA. People have marble driveways. It's just ridiculous. They raised the money, $300,000, and bought all the kids computers. They just service after service after service. These are cops, okay? These are cops. And the theory of change and the theory of policing is that if you serve the community will get to know you and they will get to trust you. And if they trust you, maybe they'll pick up the phone when there's a crime or then when they get in trouble. Just maybe the community would back the police for a change if you serve the community. So they found project after project after project to serve, just service after service after service, day in and day out. They would help the kids with their homework. They would help the old ladies get to the market and back. They would, I mean, just constant service. Well, the rest of LAPD decided they didn't like this force because they were getting too close to the community. And they started complaining. Why? Because the community service police, their crime stats were better than any other units. The crime was plummeting. Why? Because the community was policing with the police. They were picking up the phone. And finally, this gang officer called me up and he said, you know, Ms. Rice, I still don't like you. But I just wanted you to know that for the first time in my career, somebody picked up the phone and told me who the shooter in the alley was. This never happened before. And I think it's because of your program. So, if you want to know if this works, how many of you remember the Dorner matter? Remember that cop went on that killing rampage? It was all over CNN for 5 full days. Do you remember there was wall-to-wall coverage? How many of you remember? Hold your hands up. Thank you. I was afraid I was talking to folks who'd been on an iceberg or something. And that was a very scary moment in LAPD because Dorner had a list of cops he was going to kill. And he was SEAL trained. He was perfectly capable of doing it. He was LAPD trained. He was a killer. And he had shot 2 cops in San Bernardino already. LAPD, when cops get hunted, they're dangerous. Police can get very dangerous when they're hunted. And I was on edge because it was just a terrible, terrible fiasco. And I was wondering how we were going to get through this, because this guy was perfectly capable of executing a lot of police. So they finally isolated him up in San Bernardino and set a fire. Somebody set a fire, I guess he did, to this cottage, and he ended up dead. I get a call from Chief Green, who's he's the chief over the specialized community policing unit that I just described. And he said, Connie, it's over. I said, I know, Chief. I saw it on CNN. I said, when's the last time you slept? He said, 5 days ago. I said, well, that's too long. I'm going to talk you up home. I'm not going to get off the phone. I'm just going to say all kinds of provocative stuff to keep you awake. So I start ranting and raving. You know, it's going to take us 10 years to get over this. It set us back 10 years. You know, this ridiculousness. I had to be on the radio at 5 o'clock in the morning for the last 5 days trying to tell people why they shouldn't be happy that a cop's kid got killed. I said, what is wrong with people? I start going on. I start ranting and raving. He said, Connie, I don't think it's that bad. I said, what are you talking about? He said, did you hear what happened with Captain Tingarides? I said, no, what happened to Phil? Captain Tingarides, by the way, is the captain over the Community Safety Partnership Police I described. He's the captain. He said, well, the blood bounty hunters went online and they looked up Dorner's manifesto, and when they found out that Dorner intended to kill Captain Tingarides and several other Community Safety Partnership police, the blood bounty hunters, black gang, went and got their guns and called Captain Tingarides and said, we're coming to your house and we're not leaving until Dorner is dead. We're going to protect you. I said to Chief Green, you haven't slept in 5 days and I think you're hallucinating. That could not possibly have happened. Black gangsters do not volunteer to protect an LAPD captain. It's just not possible. So I went down to the housing project the next day and I found some blood bounty hunters and I asked them, what's up, guys? This couldn't possibly have happened. What are you doing? What do you mean you protected? They tell me you offered to protect Captain Tingarides and we're going up to his house to make sure he was okay. I said, what universe am I in? And they said, look, Connie, we still hate pigs. We hate LAPD. We're always going to hate LAPD. But these cops, they serve our mamas and they serve our grandparents. They protect our kids. They give our kids computers. These cops, we don't want them dead. We want them to live. So if you think that there's no way to ever bridge those gaps, there's no way to ever get police into a mindset that can make them bond with the community, you're wrong, because we've done it in LA. And we've done it with some of the hardest populations there is to do it with. 1 Latino housing project and 3 African American housing projects. And the police, it's very interesting, 50 positions, we had about 400 people apply. Disproportionately women, of course. My bias is that women make better cops. We can talk about that later. But the bottom line is that when you have police who are rewarded with the incentives, who have the incentives and get rewarded for creating relationships with very, very poor communities, they know the names of the kids, they work with the gang intervention workers. When you create that dynamic, you completely change American policing. We know the answer, ladies and gentlemen. It isn't difficult. You just have to have the leadership and you have to have the will. And then you've got to have the people who know how to train. And it takes both community members and police reform leaders together to make that kind of change, because otherwise it won't stick. So I'm afraid I did not do what I said I was going to, which was go down. If you could wave a magic wand, well, I'd change the incentives and I'd do CSP policing. Does it matter whether or not community residents see the police as a legitimate force? Of course it does. What have you seen that works in terms of building genuine partnerships? I just described it, the CSP program. In a country marked by increasing inequality and lack of opportunity, especially along racial lines, what role might police play in reversing those trends and strengthening our demand? Listen, cops are powerful. I hijack their power all the time because the politicians are afraid of them. When the police ask for a summer program, it gets done. When the police say that without a food program, they won't be able to keep public safety, you get that food program. So I have learned to hijack police power to get all kinds of social programs. And finally, is it necessary to tolerate a rise in crime in order to make policing more democratic? I'm not interested in making policing more democratic. I'm interested in making policing fair and effective. No, you don't have to tolerate a rise in crime. In fact, our crime has been plummeting. I don't know how much lower it can go in a big city. And as the crime plummets, because we've made this change in our incentives and our policing style, the trust has gone sky high. It is truly amazing. And with that, I will leave you.
Wow. Next up is Vincent Warren. Vincent is the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, a national legal and educational organization dedicated to advancing and defending the rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Prior to his tenure at CCR, Vince was a national senior staff attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union. Vincent?
Good afternoon, everybody. And it is wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for asking me to participate. I'm very intrigued by the question of democracy in policing. In fact, I was asking my colleague, Darius Charney, who's here today with the Center for Constitutional Rights, who did the litigation in Floyd versus City of New York, if democratic policing was a term of art. And neither of us had really heard of that. And I began to think about what democracy is, what relationship policing has to democracy. And because I'm at the Center for Constitutional Rights, there are really interesting things about democracy that I'm not seeing in policing. So let me lay some of those things out. Number one, I think policing in a democracy is not the same thing as democratic policing. Democratic policing seems to imply an internal order that is open, fair, and transparent, but policing in a democracy might mean something different. And I think any government entity, whether it's the police department, whether it's the Department of Sanitation, whatever it is, has a real challenge in a democracy because democracies are messy, right? They are not prone to fast solutions. They're prone to consensus-based values in which we consent as citizens to be governed in a particular way. So let's look at the democracy for a little bit. Democracy is a participatory process. Inherent in the notion of democracy is that we as a group can achieve some element of consensus about who has power, over what, and the way that that power is used. Also inherent in the notion of democracy is that the way that that power is used must be transparent enough for us to be able to assess whether there's a breach of the values that we've agreed to. And also to return to the question of when we granted the power to the government entity that has it, is this the type of power that we wanted them to have? So when we think about that, we also then think that what happens when the transparent process happens, we look at it and we say, we actually don't think that you are controlling and governing us in the way that we have consented to. We want to take that back. We want to change it. We want to flip it. We want to tweak that a little bit. What is the process for that? That is the essence of democracy. It's a constant renewal of the values that we have shared, that we share, and that we grant to the government over us. Now, those elements are almost in exact opposition to the way some police practices are run. I'm here talking about the New York City Police Department because we have a pending lawsuit regarding the New York City Police Department, and I know and I expect that other police departments around the country have grappled with these questions and found ways to make their work more democratic. Our challenge, unlike the challenge in LA when we can look back at all of the successes, our challenge in New York is that we're looking forward, and we're not necessarily seeing the clear path to success that we would like to. That doesn't mean that we can't get there. But police forces do work in the opposite way, and certainly the New York City Police Department does. It is hierarchical, it is insular, and it is non-transparent. Those are three elements of this particular police department. So one of the questions that we ask ourselves is, what would we need to do in order to change the way the New York City Police Department polices? And in order to do that, we have to kind of take the second question that I've been asked to address, and that question is, how can democratic policing address crime problems in a community? And we have to begin to flip it. And we have to ask instead, and this is what the New York City experience is right now, how do communities in a democratic society address the police problem? And so in our litigation and in our advocacy, and I'm here standing on behalf of a range of folks, including the many, many, many groups in the Communities United for Police Reform, we are grappling with the question of how do communities in a democratic society address the police problem. And the challenge and the problem is that the primary way that it happens in New York City is through litigation. I think we might all agree that there are always better solutions between community members and government than having litigation. Litigation is not the best tool. It is not the cheapest tool. And as Connie and I were talking about when we met in LA, that litigation, you can get all of the agreements that you have written in a piece of paper, but that does not equal the type of change that we need to see from a police department. So we're on this journey together. Let me give you a couple of examples of how the police culture flies in the face of some of the democratic principles that we believe in. Number one is that internalized police culture, the one that is hierarchical, the one that's insular, and the one that is non-transparent, gets externalized and it gets reinforced by the New York City Police Department. And so we have really interesting questions. So there's what I call the Fourth Amendment paradigm, the Fourth Amendment conundrum, really. So we all know that the Fourth Amendment protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. And so if we just look at seizures for a second, we would all agree that under the Fourth Amendment, if you are stopped by a police officer, there is an inherent, built into that right, an opportunity for you to say, hey, just a second, why are you stopping me? What have I done? Just even those two questions. Now let me put this in the context of how Susan raised this, where there is an order. The police come up to you and they say, get on the ground. And you say, hey, just a second, can you tell me, you won't get your sentence out because you have not complied with the order by the police department. You will not get that sentence out. Now, there is an inherent conflict between our democratic principles with the Fourth Amendment to be able to at least to be able to ask those questions, and what the police department needs from you in order to, in their view, keep the situation safe and under control, which is compliance. And what happens very often, not very often, what happens occasionally, but it happens on micro levels constantly, is that non-compliance to a police officer in terms of police officer training means that they can escalate the encounter in order to get compliance. So let's think, I'm going to let you fill in the blank. The police officer says, get on the ground, hand on the weapon, not drawn. you say, I'm not going to get on the ground yet. I have a couple of questions, right? Fill in the blanks about how that's going to go. Those are inherent tensions in our democracy. So I wanted to also mention Ferguson because Ferguson, that's the Fourth Amendment question. Then there's the First Amendment question, right? And the First Amendment question is something that we should not have to go to court to be able to discuss. The inherent nature of the First Amendment is that this is an opportunity for people to be able to speak their minds. But what happened in Ferguson, I think really implicates the First Amendment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read just very briefly a piece that my colleague from the Center for Constitutional Rights, Purvi Shah, wrote when she was in Ferguson. CCR went down to Ferguson over a couple of days to check in and to see what was happening. But this is important to read. It was a Sunday evening, and we were on West Florissant Avenue in Ferguson, where community members gather in mourning and protest every day, a few blocks away from where Michael Brown was killed. Their demands are basic. The T-shirts simply say, "Stop killing us." The protesters want an end to racist police practices, an end to criminalization of being black, and an end to the killing of their friends and their children. They want Michael Brown's killer indicted, and they want to be able to exercise their right to voice these demands vigorously and loudly to their government. As I looked around, I saw people from all walks of life, young people and elders, preachers, teachers, veterans, and while each person expressed it differently, all of the protesters were unified in their anger over Michael Brown's death. I joined the march next to a large family in orange T-shirts. They were in Ferguson for a family reunion and decided to come out and march together. As I took out my phone and began to tweet, "Justice is a family affair," we were all tear-gassed. There was no warning. It was 3 hours before the state-imposed curfew. The demonstration was peaceful, yet all of a sudden, the police began throwing tear gas canisters. People scattered in different directions. I saw two young shirtless men racing a woman in a wheelchair out of the tear gas. Someone screamed, "They gassed my baby," and another exclaimed, "They're treating us like animals." Spots that were considered safe, like the press area, were repeatedly hit. People threw tear gas canisters at fleeing crowds. There was no safe place to run. There was no safe place for people to assemble. The town of Ferguson is under siege. Now, I'm reading that because I think Connie has it absolutely right. Whatever happened in Ferguson should not be used as a model for pretty much anything moving forward. But I think it is very significant in the context of what democratic policing looks like. Because what should be clear to folks, particularly in black and brown communities in America, is that there have been roughly 400 years in which black and brown folks have been killed by various government entities extrajudicially. And in those 400 years, black and brown folks have developed a way of mourning and a way of protest. And the way of mourning those kind of killings is to be able to gather together, and to be able to articulate how you're feeling about it. Now, when that gathering together and articulation of how you feel about what you think is an unjust killing becomes an excuse, a reason, a point in which then force is applied to stop that, that is essentially the death of our democracy, and it flies very much in the face to the question of will that police department ever be able to win the trust of people in that communities. What the New York City Police Department does sometimes, and what the Ferguson Police Department did, is that they under-responded to the grief in that community because of the killing, and they over-responded to the anger. And so our challenge here as we think about New York City and stop and frisk and the killing of Eric Garner is how do we begin to deconstruct some of those questions so that we're actually now focusing on policies and practices that make sense. And I would sort of throw out that there are a number of ways that we should be thinking about that. One of them is training. Another one is community partnership. A third is accountability and oversight. And a fourth is transparency. But let me linger on community partnership for a minute, because the community partnership is absolutely key. And with all of the successes that have happened in Los Angeles, we have a particular problem here that we need to think about. And that problem really flows in two ways. We've got a police union that has taken an entirely different position from the mayor and what the police commissioner seemed to be saying. So after the killing of Eric Brown, which was on videotape, most of you in this room saw Eric Brown Eric Garner, saw Eric Garner die. In that framework, the medical examiner comes out and says that this appeared to be a homicide. Now, instead of that being the end of the story and the beginning of the judicial process, what happened? The New York City Police Union came out and said it was not a chokehold. Now, unions are part of the democratic process as well. There's no question about it. I'm very pro-union. I've got a union shop at CCR. However, we have to note that the counter-narrative by the police union relative to what the police commissioner says he wants to do becomes a big, huge issue. And it's an issue in the stop and frisk case. It's an issue in Eric Garner's case, to the point where the police union is now going after the mayor and going after the police commissioner and saying, and advertising that the convention should not come to New York City because the Sergeants Association won't be able to keep it safe because of Bill Bratton and Mayor de Blasio. This is a challenge and this is a problem. So how do we bring the police into line, and how do we bring the police union to the table? That's a question, and one of the questions that I'd love to have explored at this conference is for people that have had success in bringing the police union in line with the police brass. That is a huge, that's a huge achievement, and we need to be focused on that. Particularly, it would be helpful for us to think about how we might do that in New York City. But we do have one mechanism here in the litigation that we're particularly proud of, and we have a joint remedial process, which many of you might have heard of, which is actually based on the Cincinnati model. Cincinnati, there were many, many police killings, and as a result, rather than just going through litigation after litigation and serially around the police killings, they brought everybody together. They did community focus groups. They brought in community leaders, religious leaders, police brass, the police union, the mayor's office, the city council. They brought everybody around to the table to think through what would these joint solutions be like. Now, most of those groups end up being around some table or other. Usually what happens is the police, the mayor, the city council, everybody's having their separate discussions and figuring out how the politics of the day, how they can get the most out of the politics of the day. We have an opportunity now in New York to be able to all sit down at the table. And one of our challenges is how do we get, really two things. One is how do we get the police union there? Because the police union has to be part of the solution, and right now they're very much part of the problem. And frankly, the question moving forward is how committed is Bill Bratton to community partnership? Interesting thing, many of you may have read, if not today, you'll read it tomorrow, with that Bill Bratton did an interesting thing where he announced that the police department is going to be using body-worn cameras. Now, some of you may think that's a good thing. Some of you may think that's a bad thing. But here's what's the interesting thing, is that when we stood up in front of, with the mayor and with the police commissioner, we all had agreed on a partnership around reform. As a result of our litigation, the judge ordered on a test basis body-worn cameras. Our expectation is that as we come to the table in the joint remedial process that we will have partnership and discussions about how this happened. That did not happen. The police commissioner just today said, we're going to go this one alone. So the question really is that even in a best-case scenario, and it's arguable whether the New York City Police Department is right for change, whether they're the right people in place. We think that this is right for change and they're good people, but the question really is, if that is our community partnership model, that the police department says we're going to go it alone, it begins to look to the community members like it's the same old, that it is insular, that it is not transparent, and that it is hierarchical. Thank you.
Thank you. A lot to think about and much to talk about. And we have about 50 minutes or so to do that. So all I would ask is that you make your questions or comments as brief as you can, and please identify yourself by name and, if you wish, by any affiliation you care to share. Yes, sir. So can we...
Anyone can step up to the mics. These are also wireless, so if you'd like us to bring it to you, we can do that.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. My name is Hamid Khan. I'm here from Los Angeles. I'm with the Los Angeles Community Action Network and also an organizer with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to make some points because much has been said. And typically when we are in these plenaries, they set the tone for the rest of the conference as well. I think the issue of democracy continues to be raised, but as we speak about police and policing, we cannot have this conversation until we look at the larger framework of democracy, the political framework, the economic framework, the structural framework, and the cultural framework. So it's in that vein that I think we should be looking at law enforcement. And being in Los Angeles, having organized there for over 35 years, I'm just going to look at LAPD before we get too carried away into this romanticizing LAPD as a model for community policing. Looking at Los Angeles Police Department, when we break it down structurally, the power that they have, the sheer armaments that Los Angeles Police Department has built, it is now operating more in the mold of a counterinsurgency force rather than a community policing force. When you look at the arms, the tactical weaponry, when you look at helicopters, now they're getting drones, when you look at tasers, stun grenades, you get the picture, SWAT team, helicopters, and then when you add the massive surveillance industrial complex or the surveillance apparatus that they have created, from the minute you wake up to the minute you go to sleep, you're constantly being watched, your information is being gathered, your information is being stored, and your information is being shared. Whether it's a trapwire technology or stingray technology or suspicious activity reporting or predictive policing or high-definition cameras, you're looking at a huge architecture of surveillance that the LAPD has, and this is what a lot of times is not even put forward in these conversations. Then we need to look at the economic power of Los Angeles Police Department. LAPD, as of now, is the largest recipient of the city's budget, 55 to 56% of the money that goes to Los Angeles Police Department. When you add the police foundation through the private money that LAPD gets, and then when you look at the Homeland Security funding and federal grants, LAPD is one of the largest. It's a huge economic power base that we have. Then you need to look at the political power of Los Angeles Police Department. Right now, there are 4 city council members who are cops, and there are several of them who are reservists as well. So the political power as it is. So what I'm trying to do is this whole narrative of militarization is emerging. But I think what we need to do is to look at it that police was always militarized. We need to look at it that what does it mean beyond militarization and compare them then actually with the US military. And we draw these parallels with budget, with political power, and then we need to look at the cultural narrative that the police has well. And in that, I'd like to just put out 2 things. Let's look at the Clive and Bundy ranch of what happened as to when the ranch was violating the federal laws and the response of law enforcement. And let's look at the response, what happened in Ferguson as to what does it mean. And this is what brings us to the question of white supremacy. And I'll close it in a second. Just a couple more comments I want to make. That LAPD, I mean, Chief Beck was just reappointed. It was very interesting that out of the 5 police commissioners, 4 were recently appointed by the new mayor. The 5th one had been on the police commission for 7 years, who had followed Beck's term and who was there when Bill Bratton was there as well. He was the only commissioner who voted against the reappointment of Chief Beck because he knew very well that what was going on. LAPD had a consent decree that was taken off back in May of 2013. This year in April, it was revealed that one of the conditions of the consent decree, by putting in-car video cameras and voice monitoring equipment in patrol cars, out of the 300 patrol cars, 90 of those antennas were sabotaged by LAPD cops. 85 of those happened to be in South Central Los Angeles. So that's something, misclassification of crime report. So I think the issue here is that when we look at these things, we also need to look at the kind of power that police holds. So more than, I mean, the title of this convening is, Can Police Community Partnerships Reduce Crime and Strengthen Our Democracy? But I think what's inherent in this word crime is that it relates to the crime committed by the community. I think it's time that rather than looking at police reform, we need to transform our thinking and look at the crimes committed by the police themselves. And these are crimes against human beings. These are crimes that if they were happening somewhere out there in some other country, we call them crimes against humanity. And I think I don't want to be sounding sensationalist over here, but these are violations. These are everyday crimes. And the last point about public housing in Jordan Downs, we also organize in public housing as well. And LAPD now, what we are finding out is that is a toxic dump site. What we are also finding out from residents of the same place that was mentioned was that LAPD is also actively involved in evicting people as well, which is a violation of the jurisdiction. It is a sheriff's jurisdiction too. And so I think it is something that we need to put out there and to be very open about it and look at it through transparency. Last point, and I'll end there, is the issue of immunity as well. What is happening is, and I don't know if people may know about it, that recently ACLU issued a report on SWAT use. And they were trying to get information from Massachusetts, from police departments. What they found out was that the police departments in Massachusetts started telling them that we have corporate exemption. Now, this is something like unheard of. What they have done very smartly is that police departments in Massachusetts have come together and formed law enforcement councils, and they have taken on a 501c3 tax-exempt status. So when you ask them for these records, they ask for these corporate exemptions. So just wanted to raise these issues, and I have more to say about maybe tomorrow.
Thank you. Yeah, quick response, and then hang on just a sec. Go ahead.
Recently, there was an article written by Jason Fritz that talks about what's happening around the country, and it's about conflict zone policing, which I think is something that we are seeing. And I think, that one thing that isn't being talked about, because mental health is such a taboo issue in this country, is when you look at recruitment of officers into police departments, it's usually a plus if they come with military training. So that is something, to be looked at. And you have a lot of folks returning, from the Middle East and from other conflict zones where there really isn't. All they do is basically change from one uniform onto another. But where is the reinsertion of someone in a conflict zone setting like Fallujah, and then, being put in a community-based setting where this is a family, not a group of insurgents. So when we talk about this, please also think about what are the missing pieces, because we can definitely point fingers and say, that what is wrong and all that stuff, but there is definitely something into the conversation when we talk about the principle of proportional response. We are not in a war setting. The United States should not be in a war setting. Therefore, the people that are entering police departments should be afforded the training and the necessary supports to be able to change that mind shift and to get psychological, emotional, and et cetera, supports to be able to do their work, to do their job in police settings. But this also has to come from more push, from community members. And mental health, I understand. I'm a licensed therapist. I know that pushes people's buttons. But this is something that we really have to talk about, because as I mentioned in an earlier exercise that I did, there is something that really digs into our psyche. And this sum zero worldview of, blaming the police or blaming, the community members because, they're the wrong color. We need to really dig into, as human beings, what it is, that we are missing here.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Hi, excuse me. My name is Dr. Lenora Fulani. I'm a developmental psychologist, and I'm also a radical. I have marched in every march in the city and around the country almost in opposition to police brutality. And in 2006, I went out in the streets. I knew a lot of cops because I had met them doing the marches. And I spoke to them, and I spoke to kids. And I started doing a program called Operation Conversation Cops and Kids. I've done over 100 workshops since then with 1,000 kids and a couple thousand cops. And in 2011, the NYPD brought me on as part of a partnership. One of the things that I feel deeply concerned about, a lot of the cops who come to these workshops are young people themselves. They're almost the same age as the kids who are on the street that they are grappling with. And there are a lot of similarities between these cops and kids. There's a lot of alienation and all kinds of things. But one of the things that those of us who raise these issues don't deal with is that the policing and whatever the kids are doing on the streets is happening in the midst of poverty. what Broken Windows is about, all of this is about, is trying to figure out how to stop a lot of crime relative to working with young people and not so young people who don't have jobs in the country. So I know this is a point at which we can talk about cops and kids' relationships or cops in the black community. I also have a black male son. But there are deeper issues here, and in some ways, these are the easier things to speak about because we can be either pissed off at the cops if we're community, or we can be pissed off at the kids or the adults if we're cops. When I hear the kids think the cops were created to come into the communities and patrol them and menace them, and the cops in some ways feel the same way about the kids. But when you put them in the room together, and I'm talking about teenagers, there's a kind of transformation that takes place because the kids look at the cops and say, oh, you're people, and the cops look at the kids and say, oh, you're not only kids, but you're also poor. So I want to challenge all of us to look at this. To me, the terrible thing, one of the terrible things about Eric Gardner is that he's standing on a street corner, whether he was selling loosies or not, but that this country has reduced the role of many black men and Latino men and poor people to doing things that automatically go up against what it is that you're supposed to be doing if you're legal. And so what do you all think about the poverty that produces these kinds of interactions? I know a lot of organizations pushed for stop and frisk. What people in the community are saying to me now, and what they were saying all along, is that they're concerned because there are so many guns and because there is so much criminality and because there is so much poverty. So it's not like a straight answer. We talk about this depending on what side we come from, as if we got this stuff down. But people are living real lives. They're struggling. We can be the smartest people in the world. We can be all kinds of intellectuals. On the ground, real things are happening. So what about the poverty? What are we going to do? I am upset because Eric Gardner was forced to sell cigarettes on the streets. He was poor, and I spoke out against all of that at the march last week. But these are bigger issues, and I think we have to grapple with them at a deeper level, or we'll never resolve them. And you should come see one of my workshops.
Thank you.
Yes. I'm going to move this because I'd like to have some eye contact with Mr. Warren. So, Mr. Warren, hi, how are you?
Hi.
Hi, I'm Chief Jaffe from the NYPD. I'm the chief of the Community Affairs Bureau, and for 10 and a half years, I've been the chief of the Housing Bureau. And because I'm a respondent in the lawsuit, I'll be somewhat careful in what I say, because Mr. Charney's here, and I've already been deposed in the case.
Okay.
Let's talk about public housing, being that I've been the chief of the 2,000 cops, 10 and a half years in New York City, 425,000 authorized residents, about 625,000 residents, about 200,000 that are not authorized tenants in public housing, 334 developments in the city, about 200,000 apartments, some in clusters like the South Bronx, like Brownsville, like East Harlem, others sporadically positioned in the city of New York. City of New York in the Housing Bureau, City of New York is 1/3 crime against the person in totality, 2/3 property crime. In public housing, year after year, regardless of reductions in crime, it's 2/3 crime against the person, 1/3 property. Makes sense. In public housing, you don't have the burglaries, you don't have the stolen autos, etc., which is the majority of crime in the city. We are about 5.5% of the city's population, about 3.5% of the city's crime in totality. But when you look at the violent crime, 20% of the shootings in the city of New York, about 17%, 18% of the murders in New York City. Tremendous disproportionate amount of violent crime. Those are the facts, regardless of what characteristics you want to put on it. Those are the facts. And I agree with Dr. Fulani. A lot of this has to do with poverty. It's very easy to blame the police. And I have a huge side of me that understands community positions also on how we police them. I've worked very, very closely with the housing community. The housing community, we formed with New York City Housing Authority a community partnership. We formed a task force, safety and security task force, of which there were many committees. In addition, many of the people, the leaders in not just NYCHA, the residential leaders that are unpaid leaders, helped us write our guidelines as the elected body of all of Housing Authority, helped us write our guidelines to help police, how we police in public housing. So now you have people that live in public housing, you have cruising gangs, the majority of them are in public housing. Somebody talked before about Ground Zero. It wasn't 4 developments. We have 334 developments, 625,000 people. 60% of the robberies in public housing are inside, meaning hallways, stairwells. 20% of the shootings, probably 60% of the shots fired. I am not including shots fired when I talk about the statistics, though. You have people that write letters, call us. They're terrified to, during the day, very nice. You could visit any housing development. Late at night, people would not go outside. Elderly people that will not go outside. Children that are scared to go to school. Children that get harassed by people that live, that don't only live there, but people that trespass there. We know about the trespass, the vertical patrol policy, of which the whole lawsuit is about. Not just the Floyd case, but the Davis case. People that trespass to both buy drugs, sexually assault women, and engage in criminal conduct like do robberies, because 60% of the robberies are inside. We have people begging us to come and police their neighborhoods that are very, very upset about the stop and frisk policy, about the decrease, the tremendous decrease in stop, question, and frisk. When you go to community meetings, people, yes, they beg for help, but at the same time, and I understand this personally, standing at the head of a meeting, they say, there are 20 guys in the lobby, there are 10 guys blocking the door, there are gangs all over. Please, why do you have to stop my son? Go after the people that are doing this. So these are issues. Poverty are issues. There are many, many police officers that really, really do care about the people. I'm going to talk for public housing, not just the residents of the city, but I could say this for the residents. Many officers that care greatly about the people that live in public housing and have to deal with the situation, environmental infrastructure, economic, educational, social ills that go on in this city and throughout this country. But it's very, very easy to just say it's the police. I would like to ask you, would you raise your children? Why don't you take an apartment for 3 weeks or 4 weeks and live in a public housing development that I will pick and go in and out of the building, walk 20 stories when the elevator is broken, and allow your children, sir, to go in and out of the buildings. Last comment. 2 months ago, we moved a boy in Brownsville. The reason why we had to move his family out of Brownsville a couple of months ago was because we kept seeing him on video camera being involved in fights, where it looked like he was initiating the fights, and he was caught on camera. We intervened in that, not just by arresting him, but by talking to him first. And we found out the gang members were making him fight. It was part of an initiation. Every time he fought, he got his ass kicked. But he was still the initiator, picking fights with other people. They would go to a courtyard where it wasn't seen to the street and fight. In addition, he told us that every day the gang members, this is a 14-year-old African-American child, the gang members every day made him eat his feces. Now, this is not that unusual, maybe that part of it, and the only way we could help him and get to his family, because they were so terrified of retaliation, was to make them disappear and have them move. So I see a lot of, I understand over-policing, and I really do, but I see a lot of people that are terrified, people that join gangs because they're scared, kids that are carrying guns because they're scared. I tell my cops, if I grew up in public housing, I'd be the first one running a gang, and I'd be the first one probably carrying an illegal gun, because it's about protecting yourself when you're getting beat up. But it changes over time, right? Because after you get beat up enough, you start doing the beating up. So it is a societal issue. It's not just a police issue. And there's a lot of issues here, like Dr. Fulani just said, that are not being spoken about.
All right.
And we're just talking about the police.
Well, you just spoke about them. Next up. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Christopher Brown with PolicyLink, and had a couple questions, mainly for Connie Rice and maybe any others who had insights on some of the particular strategies on community partnerships. We hear about models. It was great to hear about LAPD and the great work that you've been leading there. And so, what the question is, and PolicyLink has been looking at this for years around lifting up models and examples for other police departments and other folks to learn from. Obviously, not much has changed nationally. It's great that we have these examples that show success, but what is it, from your perspective, is lacking to really bring these models to scale? We know it's political will, we know it's, but I'm wondering if there's something else, and maybe it's to the police culture, as Mr. Warren talked about, or it's something else. But I'm just curious for the experts on the panel, what the insights could be for how we really help disseminate these strategies, lift them up, get past the political barriers, particularly as it relates to even smaller cities who maybe could say that they don't have the budgets to do some of the innovations that other cities like LA have seen. But you know, I can't believe it's always about money. It has to be about
it's not the money.
sustainability.
It's not the money, it's the mindset. You've got to have the leadership with the right outlook and the right mindset and the determination to make the change, because this isn't just tweaking, this is transformation. So it takes police leadership and it takes community and political leadership, and they've got to be working in tandem. And there has to be a mandate set that we're changing. There's no discussion. We're not having this anymore. We're going to have cops that the community trusts, and you are going to change, or you're going to get fired. So it takes just that much will. It takes a chief like Barney, it takes a chief like Bratton, it takes that kind of transformative leadership, and they've got to have the right vision. And then the community has to be ready to dance with the cops. That's the hard part, is getting the community so that they can help the police change. Believe it or not, most cops have no idea what you mean when you say, I want humane constitutional policing. They don't know what you're talking about. And you got to be able to demonstrate to them data. You got to get in there every day, and you got to show them. That's what I found. You can't write it in a consent decree, as Vincent and I have discovered. You can write whatever you want in a consent decree. They're not going to follow it. They're not going to even know what you're talking about. And most of the cops on the ground in patrol, when you get down to patrol, they have no concept of what you're talking about. They don't know. They can't describe what they currently do, never mind what you're asking them to move to. So you've got to get in there and actually show them. It's everyday work. Susan, how long have I been in there? It's been since Bratton got there in 2002. Every day since 2002, and we're still doing it every day, and it's what, 2014? So, and we're nowhere near done. Nowhere near done. So it's more than a notion, just let me put it that way. It takes tremendous will and a tremendous mandate and tremendous leadership.
If I could add when the economy tanked in 2008, I was in the cops office then, and I made two predictions, both of which turned out to be wrong, so don't let me give you any real estate advice. But one of them was that I really believed that we would change the essence of how police patrol in agencies large and small was delivered in response to non-emergency calls. Because the great inherent conflict, and I've really been glad to hear several people say, or to acknowledge, that individual officers, by and large, overwhelmingly care about the people that they serve. Absolutely, overwhelmingly care about trying to make life better for people. If we had more time, I'd give you my whole spiel on how I don't think the system of police management supports that. But that's a different perspective. But as long as when community policing was first introduced, it was really laid on top of traditional police patrol practices. It didn't really have to become a philosophy because we had enough money that you could simply create sort of additional programs. When the economy tanked and people started to lose positions in significant ways, there was an opportunity there to change how police patrol practices and police services were delivered that we really didn't take advantage of. But the key to this whole thing is the relationships between individual officers and the people that they serve. And the only issues of scale, at least from my take, are the larger the agency, are they willing to decentralize and push decision-making down the chain of command enough to where it can continue to happen at a local level?
And to add to what Bernie said, it's also about whether we're going to reward that cop for creating the relationship. Right now, he gets no credit. She gets no credit. You get credit for making arrests, okay? You do not get credit for creating glue with the community, for creating trust. You don't get credit for that. We say we want community policing. We give them no credit and no incentives and no rewards for creating the relationships with the community. There are none. It's not part of their regimen for promotion. So how do we expect them to spend time on it? That's the other part of what Bernie's talking about.
Go ahead, Susan.
Some quick do's and don'ts. I'll start with the don'ts. I'm from El Salvador. I went back to my country when the Civil War ended in 1993, and I worked for a US-based arms dealer. I won't say which manufacturer, but it's a manufacturer here in the United States. We sold guns right after a war. As a matter of fact, we were the ones who sold the guns to the newly formed National Civilian Police. So the don't here is don't militarize your police force, which is what's happening now in El Salvador, which is one of the top 5 nations in the world that has the highest homicide rates per capita. Honduras, which is next door, has a military police, and they have the #1 homicide rate per capita. And I travel to the region all the time. I have projects there. I have family there. Don't militarize the police. Take it from people that know what that looks and feels like. The reason also why, when you militarize the police, you immediately create an imbalance of power, distrust, and you destroy relationships with the very people that they're supposed to be protecting and serving. Then what happens? People then feel the need to arm themselves, to create groups. If they don't trust the police because they're corrupt or they're afraid of them, then they create these groups like it's happening in Mexico, where they take the law into their own hands and they arm themselves. So some don'ts from our friends in Central America and Mexico. Some do's. Look at what they're doing in Toronto. They're really digging in their heels and looking at what is it that's making the police react. Basic human nature stuff. We all have biases. We all do. I know I do. We need to be real about these things. And you can't just take a cultural sensitivity one-day workshop or slap somebody on the wrist because they were insensitive and think that you're going to do years and years of socialization, of very deeply ingrained belief system where one and the other are not the same. So some do's. Look at other places where the police actually do get along with the people that they're serving.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, Sanjay Patil with the Open Society Foundations. Though my work on police reform hasn't been primarily in the United States, what I've observed in South Asia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, East Africa is if reform is to take place, it really does require progressive police leadership in order to enact the reform changes that need to take place. So on this point, what I've observed, at least in the US, is that litigation and the consent decree are useful tools in order to channel the mind of police leadership in a particular way. Now, I know Connie just sort of was a little bit dismissive of the consent decree, and she's left now, so I was going to ask her why she thinks that. But if the other panelists could maybe weigh in on what you think, and maybe even interventions from the floor, from the police, who I see many of here, what they think of both of these tools as a way to help channel the focus and attention of police leadership on issues that maybe wouldn't have come to the fore but for that crisis point that caused the litigation and or the consent decree to be enacted in the first instance.
One quick comment. I live, the community I live in borders Ferguson. We shop there, we eat there. It's our community. And I do think that a consent decree, now the Attorney General's comments today during his news conference were a little open with respect to whether a consent decree is on the way or not. But at least an investigation is going forward. But it's going to focus on the Ferguson Police Department, 53 sworn officers. The Ferguson Police Department has problems, but it is focusing an investigation, much less in a consent decree, on a single small agency where there are many, many other agencies in the area that contributed to the police response to the unrest and are, if anything, have problems that rival or exceed those in Ferguson. So here's my question for the lawyers in the room. Vincent? Prior consent decrees that I'm aware of, let's take Cincinnati, it's been mentioned as an example, and it's also an example of one that, from my understanding, worked reasonably well, have been jurisdiction-specific, agency-specific. A single agency must comply. In the case of a Ferguson, one wouldn't want to conduct an investigation under a consent decree and expect compliance from that single agency, even if you could get it, because there are many other agencies in the area with the same or even more difficult problems. Are there ways to include within a single consent decree multiple agencies?
So I want to just comment on the two tools, litigation and consent decrees. I agree that they are an excellent way to focus attention on police leadership. It's an excellent but unfortunate, expensive way to do it. But they are really important, particularly around the constitutional question. And in response to the comments and questions from the police officer, which I very much appreciated, that the Constitution actually applies in a lot of different contexts. It applies to immigrants, it applies to in jail, it applies on the streets, it even applies in public housing, right? So the question that we're dealing with is not, are the police responsible for the crime? The question that we are dealing with in this litigation is the manner in which the police are fighting crime is it constitutional or not? And because our view was that it was not, and the district court agreed with us that it was not, that puts us in a situation where we can actually have a very targeted conversation that wrestles with the following question. Well, what does constitutional and affecting policing look like? And that's what I actually appreciated from the comments. And there were a lot of facts and figures that I'm not at all at liberty to pass judgment on. And even if assuming that they were all true, the advantage of having litigation and a consent decree is that conversation can happen with the police department and with the police union and with community members and lawyers around a table, as opposed to having it in discussions like this. And I think there's real value to that.
Okay. Yes.
Consent decrees work on occasion, but the problem is they are very expensive, they are very time-consuming, and they do not achieve, generally speaking, don't achieve broad-based reform. They ought to be seen as a spectrum of potential tools. The last few years, there has been an alternative that developed out of the Justice Department referred to as collaborative reform. And the idea was that if the agency was willing to participate with the Justice Department and to identify areas of reform, that the reforms could move forward in a very public and transparent way without the expense of a monitor. In Las Vegas, The process was done in about 18 months. It cost $400,000. The test of it, the ultimate test, will be 2, 3, 4 years from now to see if the reforms are still in place. But things look good right now. The alternative are places like Oakland and Detroit and other places where a consent decree is imposed. It costs over $1 million a year. It generally enriches the people who are sort of appointed to serve as the oversight body. So I think the consent decree can work. It's got a very definite place, but it ought to be part of a broader toolbox.
Yes, here and then there. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, everybody. My name is S.Y. Boland, and I'm with the Community Mediation Services in Jamaica, Queens, and I'd like to thank everybody for everything. I would like to learn about communities that are using mediation and other conflict resolution and restorative justice processes as a way of bridging the gap. I think I have some resources that I could contribute to this. I have heard that listening, showing compassion, letting there be the presence of experiencing the feeling of the betrayal and the forgiveness and rebuilding relationships has really been very important, and that if we could imagine the concept of mindfulness policing, that could really help all of us in our work. I also want to share the idea that I've been riding the New York City train station a lot lately, and I see a sign that says, "See something, say something." I really believe that police internally could help with policing police officers. And if a police officer has a sense that someone's on the edge or that somebody needs some support or something's going down, that they too may be able to have a way of contributing this information without that same dynamic that we experience on the street, because the police are also considered a gang. So whatever, you know, as we're talking about it here. And then lastly, I would love to see some Tai Chi going on in the police force before they went out. That centering themselves, getting themselves together, and I know some places are doing this, but if you're doing some of this, please let me know. I'm working on documentation and research around that matter. Thank you.
So anyone with information about mediation or Tai Chi in police departments,
or
please.
restorative justice practices, and how it's working. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Barbara Raymond. I'm with the California Endowment. And I have a question for anybody on the panel, although Connie provoked it, which is this, you know, the Ferguson tragedy has once again brought into the public awareness the discrepancy between what police departments are composed of demographically versus what communities are composed of. Typically, we talk about race, like the big article in the New York Times this morning. I'm also interested in the gender disparity. And Connie, you mentioned that you think women make great cops. And I'd like to hear more about that. Director Melekian, from your time at the COPS office in terms of COPS hiring and so forth, what do you all think about in the traits of a police department, in the value of a department actually representing the community they serve, and so forth?
Well, I guess I'll jump in. I think there's two parts to that. And one of them, and one of the discussions that we probably really need to have, whether we have it the next couple of days or not remains to be seen. But that's the issue of workplace rules and management rules inside organizations. Because one of the realities of trying to, and the second part I was going to say, is the changing nature of diversity in this society. The issue of making a community reflect who the police department reflect the community, the reality of having more gender inclusion, more LGBT inclusion, broader frameworks is critically important. But if what you end up doing is chasing numbers instead of changing the culture, you may end up having the wrong discussion, and the workplace rules are such that you may not be able to ever keep up with it anyway. So while I think it's very important, and the COPS office pushed it, and I think chiefs around the country, the ones that are thinking about this, pursue that kind of diversity in their organizations, We've defined diversity in this country for the longest time as black and white, and then we defined it as black, brown, and white. But now we're in a place, we're in a city like Pasadena with a population of 140,000. There's 23 languages spoken in the school district. The nature of how you touch different communities is very different. Seattle has the largest, where I do some work, has the largest East African population in the United States. So the question of how we do that, I think, is a whole separate discussion, but it's important.
Yes. Oh, go right ahead.
Not necessarily responding to the question, but I do want to point something out about the use of technology. I know that there's a lot of talk about holding people accountable, holding the police accountable, making them wear cameras. I work mainly with children and adolescents, and the way that things have changed because these images, these very intrusive, easily accessible images, this is something that we haven't even begun to really understand the impact of what this is like. I know that there was a lot of talk about it after 9/11. And whenever there's a high-speed car chase that ends, and it's a horrible accident in a freeway in Los Angeles. But kids are seeing this. And it's very important, that both the community and definitely the police department take proactive steps to address how these responses, how the community is going to respond, how the police is going to respond. Silence is not the way to respond. Responding with more violence is even worse. So being able, to talk about these things with children, responding to them as if it had happened on their school campus in a safe place, because they're looking at it on the phone, they're looking at it on the computer. There is something, to be said about what it is, that children and young people are growing up with when everything that they see is left, to their own, to their own deduction.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. How are you doing, Rick? I'm Candace McCoy. I'm a professor of criminal justice here at CUNY. I'm going to respond to you, Rick. You said we'd like to hear from the lawyers.
Right.
And in addition to being, that professor thing, I am a lawyer. And I research the intersection between law and policing. So, in fact, I have recently been conducting some research about the effect of consent decrees. And so I've got a few things, just people were saying what's out there, let me say, and maybe especially, I think, not to pick on Mr. Warren, but I mean, this was really a great overview he gave of democratic policing, and maybe we could bring it around to that. In 1994, these consent decrees have only been going on since about 1994, and that's when the law was passed to allow them. There have been about 350 of them nationwide at this point. And you say, well, why haven't I heard about that? Well, there might be a lot of reasons, but to say that, a consent decree is going to make a huge difference and that's what we need and this is new is incorrect. So of the 350, first of all, your answer to the question of whether there's ever been a multi-jurisdictional one, there has not, that I know of. Nevertheless, well, there are reasons for that. We could talk about these problems of 18,000 police departments in the United States, 18,000 police departments, everything ranging from Mayberry up to NYPD, and how each one really has its own issues. And so there are reasons that they are single. But of those 350, I looked around for examples of ones that are generally regarded as having been not only successful in achieving what the consent decree itself said it would do, but sustainable, right? And the answer came back, just two of them. Cincinnati, which has been talked about, and Los Angeles, which has also been talked about. And Dr. Melekian told me today, Pittsburgh. So I'm adding it. Okay. Now I'd like to talk about Cincinnati. I'm trying to write the book, so I've done 17 interviews of the prime movers.
And it's her hometown.
And it's my hometown. UC. Yeah, okay. The people who were involved in that call it the collaborative. It was not just a consent decree. At the time of the consent decree, there was also a collaborative agreement that was worked out among the union, the Black United Front, several other community groups, the police department itself. I mean, the union put this to its membership, and they got behind it. This was the collaborative agreement, and it ran parallel to the Department of Justice's consent decree. It's my hypothesis that it's only that kind of movement that can make a difference. Mr. Warren has already mentioned the joint remedial process that has been ordered here in New York. It is the Cincinnati model, and we haven't even begun yet, as I understand it, to negotiate our collaborative agreement, and we might not get there. Cincinnati didn't think it was going to get there. So what I would say, 2 or 3 things. I'm making a speech, but I mean, you asked, Rick. Okay. When we talk about collaborative, the word from Dr. Melekian was collaborative. It's with, he made the point, the consent decrees only work if it's collaborative with the police department, but that's collaborative with the DOJ. They never work when they just kind of hold their noses and say, okay, we'll follow the consent decree. It's never going to work. When the police department buys into it, yes, they're more likely to work. But what I'm saying is the word collaborative has to also be with collaborative with the community and with the police union and with the police management. Chief Jaffe's comments over here should be replayed and take this from the police point of view and talk about that within the community. That's what they did in Cincinnati. And it took 2 years to come up with the agreement. They made that agreement, and the same monitor monitored both the Department of Justice and the community police collaborative. That doesn't mean every place should do that. That's just how they did it in Cincinnati. 11 years after a riot, which they called the rebellion, but there was a riot in Cincinnati, 2001, after the 17th young black unarmed man was shot. 17th. There have been no shootings of unarmed, found unjustified since then. And the police chief that was chosen under the new democratic structures was a black man. So there are all kinds of different changes. I'm not saying it's the answer, but consent decree per se is not the answer.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good evening, everyone. David Harris from the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. I bring you greetings from Pittsburgh, where we have just announced the hiring of our new police chief. The question I have pertains directly to that. Our police force is, I think as a number of people have said here, composed mostly of people who get up every day, want to do the right thing and do their jobs correctly. But we have had problems over the last 4 or 5 years. I'll just start with the fact that our last chief has just begun his sentence in federal prison. That's just the start of it, though. We have a great gap in trust between the police and the people that they serve. Not only the African American community, many others as well. There have been shootings. There have been incidents. I won't go into the specifics. We have been fortunate, though, at the end of a process of community meetings, meeting with the FOP, all kinds of new initiatives that followed the election of a new and very progressive mayor. We now have named a new chief, and he's a very good guy, has deep experience in community policing. I believe he'll be a very strong chief. But what I want to know from you is if you could give him one or two pieces of advice right now as he starts, and I know you don't know Pittsburgh, what would they be? And I'm going to sit down and grab my pad.
Great question. Connie, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Get a handle on the union, because the union will bollocks everything that he does or she does. Negotiate with them and make them see the light. It's hard to do. Make sure that the shivs aren't out. If your new police chief is a complete outsider, it's very important to surround him or her with real operatives who know the city, know the politics, and can tell him when the shivs are coming, when he's getting ready to be shivved. It's very important. We had to do it for Bratton when he came out to LA because he had nobody. He was an absolute stranger. If we hadn't surrounded him with knowledgeable insiders who could be trusted, as well as outside lawyers like myself and Jerry Chaliff and a couple of others, Bratton would never have made it. So those would be the first two, because otherwise he won't survive to carry out his vision of transformation. You gotta deal with the realities of the policing workplace, and it's not pretty.
Thank you. Doc?
A couple things. I would look at the administrative processes of the department. One of the realities, and there's been a number of academic papers written on this, that one of the reasons that policing values don't always manifest themselves in the community is because those values are not how officers experience being treated inside the organization. And as a result of that, there's all kinds of studies behind that. This idea of values-based and education-based discipline are concepts that are out there and worth looking at. Secondly, in Seattle, one of the biggest changes, political changes, and it was not without a fight that they made before the new chief came in just recently, was the council overturned a municipal code that forbid the hiring of outside second-level command executives and basically authorized the chief to bring in as many outside executives as she wanted to. Doesn't mean she's going to, but it changes the dynamic of what's possible. And lastly, and it was done with some success in Baltimore and now in the state of Maryland, is this notion of elevating community policing to community governance. Very often a lot of policing and public safety concerns really touch on a lot of broader issues than simply police practices. Things like street lighting, public health, roadway maintenances, those kind of things. And very often law enforcement is not involved in planning and zoning decisions, don't know anything about it. And the idea of when Martin O'Malley was mayor of Baltimore, he's now governor of Maryland, but when he was mayor of Baltimore, he changed CompStat to CityStat and took the CompStat up one level so that every city department had to participate in a CompStat-like evaluation of what was going on in the city.
Thank you. Susan?
One recommendation that I have, you have to build trust when trust has been lost. For example, Montgomery County, Maryland started a campaign called Capture the Good. Not too long ago, there was a video talking about technology and how it all plays into our daily lives. There was a video of a Montgomery police officer being aggressive and harassing and being violent with a young man. And this got out, and Montgomery County's not that big. And so this brought a lot of concern. The community was very concerned. And Montgomery County did something to very quickly counterbalance and to earn back that trust. At least they're attempting to. This campaign, it's a public media campaign, and they're very savvy about it. It's on social media. It's called Capture the Good. As Connie said, The police will get blamed, they will be pointed out, but hardly ever do we see them being put out in a way, you know, that people will say, well, yeah, they did something good. And I'll be honest with you, I've worked with folks on the other side of the law, and many of them, you know, will tell you, yeah, if I need to call the police, I would like for them to show up. So if trust has been lost, it needs to be restored. And the police have to be proactive in restoring that trust with the community in very creative ways and in very consistent ways.
Thank you. Vincent?
A couple of things. One is that one of the first stops should be to speak with community groups and community leaders, but not just the church leaders and not just the civic leaders, but the groups on the ground that are mobilizing people. They very often have very different views about what's happening. And for the community groups people and their constituencies, ask, who do you think the problem cops are? And then go into when you get to your police people, identify your idea people. Who are the people that are on the force that are going to generate new ideas to do this? Who are your change agents in the police department? And between the people that you determine are the problem ones and the people that are the path for the future, then you have some decisions. He has some decisions to make. Also, check in with female officers in the police department. I don't know what the dynamics are in Pittsburgh, but certainly that as these cultures tend to go, that their great emphasis needs to be placed on empowering women in those types of positions, and you know that does happen in the New York City Police Department. And then finally, that check in with the NAACP and with the ACLU, particularly Vic Volchek at the ACLU. But you do this thing: you ask them the questions. You say, if you were me, what are the first 5 things that you would fix? If you were you, what are the first 5 things you're going to go after us on if we step over those lines? And then you have a roadmap, because the litigation and those types of advocates can really define the trajectory of a police department. And I do think, unfortunately, that it does add up to a big mess with the union, with the FOP, because the FOP isn't going to like any of this stuff. But there we have it.
Thank you. We have 2 more speakers. We're a little bit over time, so I'm going to limit the discussion to, unless someone tells me that we can go on longer, and evidently we cannot. So these are the last 2 speakers. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Judy Green, and I run a small criminal justice policy research group based here in New York. I'm not sold on Los Angeles. Been out there twice, done a couple of studies that you can find on our website. One a few years ago about the gang enforcement issues, and then more recently looking at LA under the improvements of the consent decree. I will concede quickly that by many measures there is important improvement, but there are 2 areas I think where the consent decree model begins to wobble. One is a recent report by the OIG, Bustamante, released just last week or so, blowing a big hole through the early warning system, that it's not adequately, it's fingering cops who don't turn out to be big problems, and it's missing a lot who are. And I think this speaks to an issue with the DOJ model, which is much of what they do is kind of a checklist. Do you have this policy? Do you have that policy? Whatever. And sometimes having it doesn't mean that it's really working. The second issue, we looked at data produced by the police department about resident complaints. And one area that I'm trying to remember, between 2002 and 2007 maybe, or 2004 and 2007, you can check our report, where things seem to have consistently gotten worse, and this is really troubling, is biased policing, is racial. And I think, that's the central issue, isn't it, here in New York with stop and frisk, and in Staten Island, and in Ferguson. So that's a really important one for me. I've also spent some time in Cincinnati, done some intensive interviews with my friend Candace, came away with a feeling like things have really changed there with, I mean, there's still some problems, but in a sustained way. And I think the key is that if you take a look at the Cincinnati Collaborative Agreement, I mean, look at the DOJ thing too, but the Collaborative Agreement comes as close to what's been done, I think, anywhere to residents at the table in a fairly parallel way with the police department, with the union, hammering out what they want. I think this goes to, I mean, let's talk about policing in a democracy in the large sense. Connie, I'm not so sure that the police job is to deliver public health services, pick up the garbage services, you know, education services, even laptops. In a democracy, I think, maybe it's overly idealistic, but a democracy means that people have a real voice in what they need, and government is responsive. And if government is providing those services, which it should because people want and need them, then we can talk about defining what is the function of the police in a democracy. You know, we might not get there, but at least it kind of glows on the horizon for me when I think about these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to respond. Really quickly, this is what the community said they wanted the police to do, and that's why they're doing it. May not agree with that's what they ought to do, but they're building trust. They're building trust in the one way they know how to do it, and it's working.
Thanks. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Jin Hee Lee. I'm an attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and we filed a lawsuit that's related to the Floyd stop and frisk case. It's Davis versus City of New York, and I wanted, you know, Chief Jaffe's comments were equally directed to me as well as Vince Warren, and I wanted to make a few responses. I think that it's certainly true that there are problems with crime in public housing, but I think that's true, you know, in places outside of public housing. I think it's also equally true that not all public housing developments have the same problems with crime, and I think that as a counter to what Chief Jaffe had said, I did want to share my client's experience of being a young black man who graduated from Bedoin College, lived in the same public housing building his entire life since he was 3 years old, was employed at Harlem Children's Zone, and he himself was actually not afraid of being in his building because he knew his neighbors. He lived there his whole life, and he was arrested for trespassing in his own apartment building because he was in the stairwell. And thankfully, his case got dismissed, and he is now employed at the Annenberg Foundation. But you can imagine that arrest for trespassing in his own building could have had devastating consequences in his life. And I mentioned this not to debate the issue of who is right or who is wrong, but I think that you know, the theme of the panel was to have democratic principles in the notion of police reform. And I think that the fact that there are very different perspectives on people's experiences with police, and that there are serious concerns about having safety and security in everyone's homes, every community, regardless of who they are, I think they're really serious. I mean, those are important concerns, but it is equally important to have as many diverse perspectives engaged in that conversation, which I think we're all hopeful for in the joint remedial process that the Floyd litigation was able to achieve. And so for that, I just wanted to kind of make sure that I think very important perspective, especially in terms of public housing, was made, and for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, now I said I'd limit it to the final two. If you have a very brief comment.
I'll try to make it brief.
Make it brief, please.
I have a lot of friends who are in the police department, and there are two primary complaints that they talk about, some of them who are getting ready to retire, and I wonder if you have any ideas on how to address them. They say that some of the best cops that I know, that they don't feel it's easy to have a voice in the department. They feel that dissent is very challenging, and it's highly politically run. And so some of the best people stay quiet in order to survive. I don't know if you have any ideas about that. They also say that the younger policemen are not well trained, and that they see more bullying by younger policemen than they've ever seen in the past. These are people who've been with the force for 30 years. while there's definitely a problem with racial profiling and racism, there also seems to be clearly a problem with militarization, people getting weapons, war weapons being given to police departments across the country. How do we stop this? This seems incredibly stupid, particularly why people are poorly trained. Then finally, there's the issue of accountability. It's one thing if you shot somebody by mistake, somebody who's had a heart attack, some very strange things, people carrying hoses and they get shot because they think it's a gun. But then the ambulance doesn't get called for 30 minutes. Okay, so I wonder how we can increase accountability, because if we want to build trust, I think it starts partly when someone does the wrong thing. A policeman does the wrong thing, we hold them accountable as well as support the good police. And the people who did nothing, the bystanders who sat around, I think they need to be accountable too, and to build trust back. So if you have any ideas, I'd like to hear.
Thank you. All right. Thanks for an extraordinarily productive conversation, I thought. So I want to thank the panel. Thank you for leading us off. And thank all of you who are as much a part of this conversation as anyone else. Thank you very much. And let's thank the Karen Terry, Preeti Chauhan, and the other organizers for bringing us together.